Imagine, if you will, a global movement. But I want you to completely discard the usual blueprints for how these things are actually built.
Right, like the standard historical models.
Exactly. I want you to banish the idea of, powerful emperors marshaling massive legions across the Mediterranean
Yeah.
and erase the modern concept of tech billionaires scaling some platform with just endless streams of venture capital.
Which is how we think of scale today, right?
Totally. Instead, I want you to picture a global movement built by, well, a handful of first-century fishermen, guys whose primary social capital was quite literally the smell of their daily catch.
Yeah, we are not talking about the elite here.
Not at all. Add to that roster a universally despised tax collector who, actively collaborated with an occupying army.
A literal traitor to his own people.
Right. And then throw in a political radical who likely slept with the dagger under his cloak, and a former religious persecutor whose previous full-time job was, well, hunting this exact group down.
It is a completely volatile mix.
It's insane. Imagine that entirely unlikely, highly combustible, completely motley crew somehow forming the foundation of a community that would, within just a few centuries, completely overwhelm the Roman Empire and eventually, span the globe.
Yeah.
You have to admit, if we look at this strictly as a historical phenomenon, the sheer improbability of it is staggering.
It really is. I mean, it defies almost every conventional metric for how historical movements are supposed to scale, let alone survive.
Right, because the odds were entirely against them.
Exactly. If you were a sociologist, right, observing the first century Mediterranean world, and you ran the data on a movement starting with those specific individuals.
In that specific region.
Yes, in that highly combustible region of Judea, your model would predict total failure.
You would say this ends in a week.
Pretty much. A group like that should have fractured under internal ideological pressure or just been completely eradicated by Roman authorities within a single generation.
And yet, here we are. They are still the subject of massive academic study 2 millennia later. So today, we are embarking on a really comprehensive deep dive into what historians call the apostolic age.
The foundational era.
Exactly. We are examining the life, the mission, and the historical footprint of the 12 apostles, and, arguably the most influential author of antiquity, the Apostle Paul.
And just to clarify the methodology for you listening, we are synthesizing a vast array of sources for this deep dive.
We're pulling from a lot of different disciplines today.
We really are. We are analyzing the canonical and historical texts, so specifically the gospel accounts, the book of Acts, and the Pauline epistles.
But we aren't just reading them in a vacuum, right?
No, not at all. Yeah. We are reading those texts through the lens of hard archaeological data and really rigorous sociological research concerning the Roman Mediterranean world during that late Second Temple period.
So we're looking at the dirt, the politics, everything.
Exactly. We are going to look at the political environment, the complex religious marketplace they were operating in, and the brutal economic conditions that really forged these individuals.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at how a seemingly local, highly controversial Judean movement expanded from the, agrarian dusty roads of Galilee all the way to the marble columns of Rome.
The absolute epicenter of power.
Right, and in just a few decades. To understand how that happened, we have to look at the foundational architecture of the movement.
The blueprint, so to speak.
Yeah, the texts describe Jesus choosing exactly 12 apostles. And reading through the sources, it becomes immediately apparent that this number is, well, it's not an accident of history.
No, the math is entirely deliberate.
This isn't a situation where Jesus just happened to have a dozen friends hanging around, or he drew up a corporate org chart and decided, hey, 12 is a manageable number for a board of directors.
Right. The number 12 is arguably the loudest theological statement Jesus makes before he even preaches a single sermon.
Wait, the loudest statement?
I would argue yes. Because in the canonical texts, the 12 function as a deliberate, highly visible sign of a newly constituted Israel.
Ah, going back to the Old Testament roots.
Exactly. By intentionally selecting exactly 12 men, Jesus is directly echoing the 12 tribes of ancient Israel.
So it's a massive symbolic gesture.
Huge. For a first-century Jewish audience, the implication is inescapable. The theological claim being presented here is one of covenant restoration.
He's putting the band back together.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Jesus is signaling that he is gathering the scattered tribes and constituting a renewed covenant people around himself.
So he's not just some guy with a new philosophy.
Right. He is not presenting himself as just another traveling philosopher or some local rabbi with a fresh interpretation of the Torah. The texts present him as the catalyst for the historical destiny of Israel itself.
I find the structural messaging there just fascinating. It's somewhat akin to, well, imagine a political dissident in a really fractured country.
Okay, I track with that.
And he intentionally forms a shadow cabinet with exactly the same number of seats as the current corrupt government.
Right. The structure itself is a provocation.
Exactly. The sheer mathematics of the group communicates your ultimate ambition before you ever release an official manifesto. You don't even have to say a word.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. The medium is the message, essentially. And we see exactly how vital this numerical symbolism is to the early community when we examine the opening chapter of the book of Acts.
Right after the crucifixion?
Yes. Following the crucifixion, after Judas Iscariot has betrayed the group and died, the remaining followers are gathered in Jerusalem.
Just kind of waiting around, right?
Waiting for the Spirit, yeah. But before they preach, before they begin any sort of public expansion, their very first administrative action is to replace Judas.
They hold an election.
Essentially, yes. They nominate and select a man named Matthias to take that 12th spot.
Okay, so let me challenge the logic of that for a second. From a purely functional modern perspective, that seems like, I don't know, unnecessary bureaucracy.
How so?
Well, they already have 11 highly trained, deeply committed leaders ready to go. They have this massive global mission ahead of them. Why hold up the entire operation just to fill a vacant seat?
It seems inefficient, right?
Totally. Does the mission really fail if they only have 11 guys preaching instead of 12?
Functionally, no, not at all. 11 men could have easily carried the message just as far.
So why do it?
Because symbolically and theologically, the sources indicate they absolutely could not proceed without a 12th. The appointment of Matthias isn't an HR exercise to distribute the workload.
It's not about making sure everyone has enough days off.
No, it is symbolically essential to preserve the foundational completeness of this restored assembly.
Ah, so it goes back to the tribes.
Exactly. In Jewish eschatological thought, the end of the age would see the 12 tribes gathered and judged. By ensuring there are exactly 12 leaders before the Spirit is poured out at Pentecost, the community is boldly claiming, "We are the restored remnant of Israel, fully intact and ready to inherit the promises."
I see. You need the complete foundation before you can start building the house. The blueprint has to be flawless.
Precisely.
But looking at the terminology used in the texts for these foundational figures, there is a shifting vocabulary that I think we really need to define for the listener.
Yeah, the Greek terms are important here.
Because we see these men referred to primarily as disciples early on in the story, but later they're almost exclusively called apostles.
Right.
And in modern religious parlance, people tend to use those words completely interchangeably. But the Greek text doesn't do that, does it?
No, it doesn't at all. And that distinction is crucial for understanding their evolving role in the movement. Let's actually look at the original language for a minute.
Let's do it.
The Greek word for disciple is mathetes.
Mathetes, okay.
Yeah, it translates literally to a learner, an apprentice, or a pupil.
Like a student.
Exactly. In the Greco-Roman and Jewish worlds, a mathetes attaches themselves to a rabbi or a philosopher. Their goal is to learn their teacher's way of life, to absorb their teachings, and to emulate their character.
So it's very relational.
Very much so. So chronologically and relationally, they're all mathetos first. They spend years just listening, observing, and honestly, often failing to understand.
So there are students in the classroom taking notes, making mistakes, occasionally failing the pop quizzes.
That's a perfect analogy. But then we have the Greek word for apostle, which is apostolos.
And that means something else entirely.
It does. It carries a much heavier, more specific civic and political weight. It translates to sent one or an authorized envoy.
Like an ambassador.
Very similar. It is closely related to the Hebrew concept of a shaliach, which is a designated agent who carries the full legal and personal authority of the one who sent them.
So the transition from Matheos to apostolos is basically graduation.
Yes.
It's moving from the classroom into the field, but with a very specific delegated authority.
And that delegated nature is the absolute key to understanding how they operated. In the ancient world, an envoy did not operate on their own prestige.
Because they probably didn't have any, right?
Exactly. The texts emphasize that the apostles' authority did not originate from their social rank, their wealth, or their institutional pedigree. Most of them had zero social capital.
Just fishermen and tax collectors.
Right. Their authority was entirely derived from their vocational mission. They were authorized eyewitnesses to the resurrection, sent out directly by Christ.
Okay, but that grand, sweeping theological claim, this idea of a restored Israel led by authorized envoys, it doesn't just float in the spiritual ether.
No, it lands in a very real place.
It lands with a massive thud in the heavily militarized, hyper-political first-century Roman world.
It was a brutal environment.
Extremely. And we know this narrative isn't just some theological fable set in a mythical realm because we can literally dig up the bureaucratic receipts of the people who are trying to crush it.
The archaeology is incredible for this period.
It really is. The geographic scope of this movement, tracing from the agrarian villages of Galilee to the administrative center of Caesarea, up to Antioch, across the trade routes of Asia Minor, into Macedonia, and finally Rome. It places it squarely under the uncompromising boot of Roman imperial power.
The apostolic period unfolds in a deeply historically grounded environment. And this is where the synthesis of our sources becomes incredibly robust.
Because we aren't just relying on texts.
Right. We can cross-reference the canonical texts with physical archaeology. We have hard evidence, literal stones pulled from the dirt that authenticate the specific historical, political, and social backdrop of these narratives.
Let's get into the dirt then, because digging up the apostolic age is where the historical methodology really shines. I want to start with a piece of limestone that completely silenced decades of historical skepticism.
You're talking about the Pilate inscription.
Yes, the Pilate inscription. For a long time, Pontius Pilate was this infamous central figure in the gospel accounts, right? He's the guy who sentences Jesus to the cross.
The main Roman antagonist.
Exactly. But outside of some brief mentions by historians like Tacitus or Josephus, we had zero physical evidence he actually existed. He was almost a ghost in the archaeological record.
He really was.
Oh.
And that lack of physical evidence led some 19th and early 20th century critics to theorize that Pilate might have just been a literary invention.
Wait, they thought he was entirely made up.
Some did, yeah. They thought he was a fictional Roman antagonist created by the gospel writers to shift the blame for the crucifixion away from Jewish authorities and onto a made-up Roman governor.
Wow. That's a massive claim.
It was a popular theory in some circles, but that academic consensus was completely shattered in 1961.
Right. So Italian archaeologists are excavating in Caesarea Maritima, which is on the coast of modern-day Israel. And just to set the scene for you listening, Caesarea wasn't some minor dusty outpost.
Far from it.
It was essentially the Roman administrative capital of Judea. Herod the Great built it up massively, had a deep-water port, amphitheaters, palaces.
It was very Roman.
Extremely. It was where the Roman governors actually lived to avoid the religious tension and just the claustrophobia of Jerusalem.
Yes, Jerusalem was a powder keg, especially during the big religious festivals like Passover. Pilate would only travel there when absolutely necessary to keep the peace and oversee the crowds.
Right. So these archaeologists in Caesarea are excavating a theater, and they find a piece of limestone that had been repurposed.
It had flipped over, right?
Yeah, it was actually being reused as a paving block in a staircase during a later renovation of the theater. But originally, it was a dedicatory plaque. And on it is a Latin inscription dedicating a building, likely a temple, to the Emperor Tiberius, known as a Tiberium.
And the name on it is what changed everything.
Clear as day, carved into the stone, is the name, Pontius Pilatus, and it gives his exact official title, Praefectus Iudae, Prefect of Judea.
It's just a stunning find. The Pilate inscription is a massive, irrefutable archaeological anchor. It proves that this specific Roman official held this exact bureaucratic office during the early 1st century CE.
Which precisely matches the timeline in the texts.
Precisely matches the timeline and the political context of the biblical texts. It forces historians to acknowledge that when the source texts describe the mechanics of Roman occupation, the bureaucratic hierarchy, and the specific personnel involved in the trial of Jesus, they are reporting on the actual grounded reality of the era.
It anchors the narrative in cold, hard Roman bureaucratic stone.
It really does.
But there is another piece of rock that I find even more crucial when it comes to piecing together the timeline of the apostolic age, specifically the expansion led by Paul.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
It sounds like an obscure museum piece, but it essentially acts as the Rosetta Stone for dating almost the entire middle section of the New Testament. You have to talk about the Gallio inscription.
The Gallio inscription is a historian's dream. It really is. To understand its value, we first have to look at the canonical claim being made.
set the stage for us.
So in the book of Acts, chapter 18, the narrative places Paul in the city of Corinth, which is located in the Roman province of Achaia in modern-day Greece.
Okay.
Paul is dragged into court by his local opponents, and he stands trial before the Roman proconsul. And the text specifically names this proconsul as Gallio.
Okay, so the text makes a very specific, testable historical claim. Paul was in Corinth at the exact same time a man named Gallio was running the province.
Exactly. Now we shift our focus across the Aegean Sea to Delphi, Greece. At the turn of the 20th century, archaeologists discover fragments of an inscription carved into the wall of the Temple of Apollo.
Just carved right into the temple wall.
Yes. This inscription is actually a copy of a letter from the Roman Emperor Claudius dealing with local civic matters in Delphi. But in this incredibly detailed imperial correspondence, Claudius specifically references his, quote, friend and proconsul L. Junius Gallio.
Wow. So we have independent imperial confirmation that Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia?
We do.
But how does that give us a date? I mean, emperors wrote a lot of letters.
That's the beautiful part, and it's because of the meticulous nature of Roman imperial records. In the inscription, Claudius mentions that he's been acclaimed imperator for the 26th time.
Okay, they loved their titles.
They did. And by cross-referencing that specific title and number with other securely dated Roman historical records and monuments throughout the empire, historians can pinpoint the exact time Claudius wrote that letter.
Down to the year.
Almost down to the month. It dates to roughly the spring of 52 CE. And since Roman proconsuls typically served one-year terms starting in the early summer, we can date Gallio's term in Corinth with remarkable precision to 51-52 CE.
That is incredible. So we can take that date 51 to 52 CE and basically staple it directly onto Acts chapter 18.
Yes.
It's like finding a timestamp on an ancient document.
It provides a fixed, undeniable chronological anchor. Once you know exactly when Paul was standing in that Corinthian courtroom, you can reconstruct the timeline in both directions.
Oh, because you know how long he stayed in different places?
Exactly. You can work backward to accurately date the Jerusalem Council, his early missionary journeys through Asia Minor, and his time in Antioch. And then you can work forward to calculate his extended stay in Ephesus, his subsequent journeys, and his eventual imprisonment in Rome.
So it organizes the whole narrative.
It takes a series of narratives and places them onto a highly structured, scientifically datable framework.
It is incredibly satisfying when the archaeology clicks into the text with that level of precision. But we have to exercise some intellectual honesty here, right?
Always.
Not every artifact pulled out of the sand is a perfect, uncontested puzzle piece. The sources highlight that serious historical methodology requires a high degree of caution.
It's not all Indiana Jones.
Right. We cannot treat every ancient stone with a biblical name on it as absolute, unquestionable proof. We need to dissect the controversies surrounding two very famous artifacts, the Erastus pavement and the James ossuary.
Caution is definitely the hallmark of good historiography. Let's evaluate the Erastus pavement first, because it perfectly illustrates the nuance required in these studies.
Walk us through it.
In Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 16, verse 23, he sends greetings from a man named Erastus. Paul specifically identifies him as the oikonomos of the city.
Oikonomos, what does that mean in this context?
It essentially translates to the city treasurer or the director of public works. And it's widely accepted by scholars that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans while he was staying in Corinth.
So we are looking for a man named Erastus who handles public money and civic infrastructure in the city of Corinth around the mid-1st century.
Precisely. And in 1929, archaeologists excavating a paved plaza near the theater in Corinth uncover a large Latin inscription set right into the paving stones.
And what does it say?
It reads, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, paved it at his own expense.
And an aedile is what?
An aedile was a high-ranking civic official responsible for public buildings, streets, and markets, perfectly aligning with the role of a city treasurer, or oikonomos.
Okay, if I'm a casual observer, I'm calling that a smoking gun. You have an Erastus in Corinth who does public works in the exact right city with the exact right job description. Case closed, right?
It is intensely tempting to make that direct one-to-one correlation. However, historians must push back against that urge.
Why? It seems so obvious.
Well, first, Erastus was not an entirely uncommon name in the Roman world. It wasn't like finding someone with a highly unique name. Second, the prosopography, which is the study of historical persons and their connections, is very tricky here.
Because of the dating.
Yes. The exact dating of the pavement is hotly debated among archaeologists. Some place it squarely in the mid-1st century, which would match Paul, while others argue it belongs to a later period, maybe the second century.
So it might be the right guy, or it might be his grandson, or just another wealthy guy named Erastus a century later who wanted to pave a road.
Exactly. What the pavement undeniably proves is the civic reality of Corinth. It illuminates the social elite, the massive costs of public benefaction, and the status-driven environment of the city.
It gives us the vibe of the city.
Yes, it proves that Paul's letters accurately reflect the socioeconomic dynamics of these Roman colonies. But its exact link to the specific Erastus mentioned in Romans 16 remains methodologically probable, but not certain.
Which brings us to the James ossuary, where the methodological debate goes from cautious to just downright explosive. I want to make sure you listening understand what this object is first.
Right, the context is important.
An ossuary is essentially a limestone bone box. In the ancient Jewish burial tradition of the 1st century, a body would be laid in a cave tomb to decompose. About a year later, the family would return, gather the bones, and place them into an ossuary to make room for the next burial.
Yes, it was a very specific, localized burial practice in the Jerusalem area, spanning roughly from the 1st century BCE to the destruction of the city in 70 CE.
So it's a very tight window.
Very tight. And in 2002, an ossuary was announced to the world that caused an absolute earthquake in biblical archaeology. Carved into the side of the box was an Aramaic inscription reading, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus."
I mean, if that inscription is fully authentic, it is arguably the most significant archaeological artifact in human history, directly naming the immediate family of Jesus of Nazareth.
The implications would be staggering, absolutely staggering. But there's a massive methodological problem: provenance.
Where did it come from?
Exactly. The ossuary did not come from a controlled, scientifically documented archaeological excavation. It surfaced through a private antiquities collector in Israel named Oded Golan.
So it was just sitting in a guy's apartment.
Pretty much. And because it lacked an archaeological context, we don't know exactly where it was found, what tomb it was in, or what was around it. The chain of custody is irreparably compromised.
And that immediately opens the door to accusations of forgery, which led to the trial of the century in the Israeli antiquities world.
It really did. The Israeli Antiquities Authority formally accused Golan of forgery. The ensuing scientific debate was incredibly complex.
But what did the science say?
Well, most experts agree that the limestone box itself is genuinely ancient, dating to the 1st century. The primary debate centers on the patina.
The patina being the crust on the stone.
Right, the micro layer of biological and chemical residue that builds up on an object over centuries. Some geoarchaeologists analyzed the patina inside the carved grooves of the inscription and argued it was ancient and continuous, meaning the whole inscription is authentic.
But the skeptics push back hard on that, don't they?
Extremely hard. Other experts argued that a sophisticated forger could have taken a genuinely ancient box that originally only said James, son of Joseph, which are very common names, and recently carved brother of Jesus into it.
And then faked the patina.
Yes, using a synthetic paste to fake the ancient patina in the new grooves. After a trial lasting several years, the judge actually acquitted Golan of the forgery charges, stating that the prosecution failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was a fake.
But an acquittal in a criminal court isn't the same as an authentication in the court of history.
Precisely. The judge explicitly noted that the ruling did not mean the inscription was authentic, only that forgery wasn't legally proven. The scholarly community remains deeply divided on it.
So what's the takeaway for us?
The takeaway here is that an artifact can be intensely fascinating. It can generate endless academic papers without being methodologically decisive. We cannot build our historical timeline or our foundational theology on contested items. We must rely on the unshakable anchors like the Pilate and Gallio inscriptions to establish the historical bedrock.
I think that's a brilliant distinction. We anchor to the bedrock, and we treat the contested items as fascinating potential context.
Exactly.
But, as much as I love the archaeology, stones and inscriptions only tell us the where and the when. They don't really tell us the who or the how.
They lack the human element.
Right. We need to transition from the imperial bureaucracy to the flesh and blood people living in these ancient trade hubs. Because if you truly want to grasp the social shockwaves this movement caused, you have to understand the intense, often brutal sociological context of the 1st century Mediterranean.
This is where the historical data shifts from chronicling a timeline to explaining a radical social phenomenon. The apostolic world was fundamentally alien to our modern Western sensibilities.
We think of individualism and equality.
Right, and they had none of that. It was a world dominated by intense household-based social hierarchies, rigid systems of patronage where clients owed endless favors to wealthy patrons.
Like a mafia system almost.
Very similar dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
It also included the pervasive, brutal institution of Roman slavery and overarching all of it, a suffocating culture of honor and shame.
We really need to linger on that honor and shame dynamic because it is essentially the operating system of the ancient world.
It drove everything.
In our modern context, if you fail at a task or commit a moral wrong, the primary negative emotion you feel is internal guilt, right? It's a private crisis of conscience. You feel bad inside. But in the first century Mediterranean, your worth was not determined by your internal feelings. It was entirely dictated by how the community viewed you.
Honor was not just a nice compliment. It was a tangible, vital currency. It was a zero-sum game. If you gained honor, someone else lost it.
It's highly competitive.
Incredibly competitive. Gaining honor or desperately avoiding public shame dictated every social interaction, every marriage arrangement, every business deal, and every public dispute.
So what happened if you were shamed?
To be publicly shamed was equivalent to social death. You would lose access to patronage, your family would be ostracized, and your economic survival would be severely threatened.
And it is within that highly stratified, honor-obsessed, deeply class-divided society that we have to look at the inner circle Jesus constructs. Let's look at the 12 again. Not as theological symbols this time, but as sociological data points.
Okay, let's break down the roster.
You have several fishermen who are basically blue-collar tradesmen, but then you have two figures who turn this group into an absolute sociological powder keg, Matthew and Simon the Zealot.
These two individuals represent the extreme polarized ends of the first century Jewish political spectrum.
Let's analyze Matthew first. He is identified as a tax collector. Now, in the context of Roman-occupied Judea, a tax collector, a publicanus, wasn't just a grumpy bureaucrat working for the IRS.
No, it's a completely different level of animosity.
He was viewed as a literal traitor to his nation and his God. Rome didn't usually collect its own taxes in the provinces, right?
Right, they outsourced the job to locals who would bid for the contract.
So Matthew is a Jewish man who has actively collaborated with the occupying Roman military force to extract wealth from his own oppressed people. And the system was built on extortion. Tax collectors made their profit by charging the people more than Rome demanded and keeping the surplus.
He represented systemic corruption, compromise, and the economic exploitation of Israel by a pagan empire. In the honor and shame culture, he had traded his honor among his people for the wealth and patronage of Rome.
He sold out.
He was the ultimate sellout. He would have been fundamentally despised, barred from the synagogue, and considered ceremonially unclean.
And then, standing right across from him in the same inner circle, you have Simon the Zealot.
The exact opposite end of the spectrum.
Right. The Zealot movement was the ideological opposite of a tax collector. They were fiercely nationalistic, aggressively anti-Roman political radicals. Some factions within this broader movement believed that paying taxes to Rome was literally an act of idolatry against God.
They were willing to use extreme violence to achieve their aims. The most radical among them, the Sicarii, or dagger men, were known to carry concealed blades in crowded festivals.
And they would use them, right?
Oh, absolutely. Right. Assassinating Romans and Jewish collaborators,
yeah,
and then just slipping back into the crowd.
So we have a man who gets rich by collecting Roman taxes, and a man who believes that collecting Roman taxes is an offense punishable by assassination.
Yes.
And Jesus calls both of them to be his authorized envoys. How does this even work? I mean, if I force a violent anti-government revolutionary and a deeply corrupt establishment corporate lobbyist to share a tiny apartment,
yeah,
they don't form a global movement. One of them ends up dead.
That is the most logical outcome.
Huh?
But the canonical texts present their inclusion not as a quirky historical detail, but as a profound radical sociological statement.
Like what?
By bringing these two mortal enemies into the same covenant community, Jesus is demonstrating a kingdom that completely transcends existing political and economic allegiances.
Their primary identity is no longer Roman collaborator or violent revolutionary.
Exactly. Mercy and a shared calling are reconstituting their identities. In a world obsessed with status and factional loyalty, their unity was a massive disruption. It proved that this new community had the power to reconcile the irreconcilable.
They actually had to live together.
They had to learn to eat together, to wash each other's feet, and to share a common mission. It's astounding.
It is a radical reimagining of human relationships that completely bypasses the Roman social ladder. But, I think we often focus so heavily on the loud, politically explosive figures that we ignore the rest of the group.
We do tend to gloss over the quieter ones.
Right. The sources give us incredibly nuanced psychological profiles of the lesser-known apostles, what we might call the quiet faithful. And analyzing them reveals how this movement functioned day to day in the religious marketplace. Let's look at Andrew, Philip, and Thomas.
Andrew provides a fascinating model of influence. He is actually one of the earliest followers, having previously been a disciple of John the Baptist.
But he's not a flashy guy.
Not at all. If you analyze his appearances in the Gospel of John, Andrew is almost never the center of attention. He isn't preaching to thousands. Instead, almost every time he is mentioned, he is quietly acting as a conduit, introducing someone else to Jesus.
Like he brings his aggressive, loud brother, Peter.
Exactly. He brings the boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus when the crowd is hungry. Later, he intercepts a group of Greek seekers who want to meet Jesus and facilitates the introduction.
So he's a connector.
Andrew embodies a behind-the-scenes evangelistic instinct. It demonstrates that the foundational architecture of the movement didn't just rely on charismatic public speakers. It relied heavily on individuals who excelled at interpersonal connection and quiet networking.
Which is a huge contrast to Philip, who seems to approach everything like a stressed-out project manager.
Philip is great. He represents a highly practical, almost skeptical temperament. When Jesus is faced with a massive hungry crowd and asks Philip how they should buy bread, Philip doesn't offer a spiritual platitude.
He doesn't say God will provide.
No, he immediately starts doing the financial math. He calculates that half a year's wages wouldn't be enough to give everyone a single bite. Later, during the Last Supper, when Jesus is speaking in complex theological terms about the Father, Philip bluntly interrupts and says, "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us."
He wants tangible proof. He wants a flowchart.
He wants practical answers.
Yeah.
And what the narrative suggests is that this practical, inquisitive nature is not condemned. His honest, blunt questions actually serve as the catalyst for Jesus to reveal deeper theological truths.
There's room for the pragmatic thinkers.
Yes, it shows that the apostolic community had room for people who needed things spelled out.
Which perfectly sets up the most misunderstood figure in the group, Thomas. He has been labeled Doubting Thomas for 2 millennia, which feels like a massive historical injustice to me.
It's a very unfair nickname.
If you read the text objectively, he doesn't represent cynical disbelief. He represents intense intellectual honesty.
That is a much more accurate reading of his character. When Jesus first appeared to the disciples after the resurrection, Thomas was absent. When the others tell him they have seen the Lord, Thomas refuses to simply conform to the group dynamic.
He won't just nod and agree.
Right. He essentially states that the claim is too massive, too reality-altering to be accepted on hearsay alone. He demands empirical evidence to see and touch the wounds.
And in a modern context, we would praise that. We would call it critical thinking. He isn't going to pretend to believe just because peer pressure dictates he should.
And the text validates his need for truth.
Mm.
Jesus doesn't reject him for his skepticism. He appears specifically to offer Thomas the evidence he requires.
And Thomas's reaction is huge.
It is. Upon receiving the evidence, Thomas doesn't just offer a polite acknowledgement. He utters arguably the highest, most explicit Christological confession of the entire Gospel of John, "My Lord and my God."
So the doubt actually led to deeper faith.
Yes. Thomas demonstrates to the early church that deep, resilient faith does not require the suppression of intellectual doubt. Rather, unbreakable faith can actually emerge through an honest, skeptical encounter with the truth.
I love that analysis. It makes these ancient, seemingly mythical figures feel incredibly human. They're navigating skepticism, practicality, and intense political friction.
They were real people dealing with real issues.
But here is the massive logistical problem. If this incredibly diverse, sometimes combative, sometimes doubtful group of men was going to survive in the ruthless environment of the Roman Empire, they couldn't just be a loose collective of personalities.
No, a committee wouldn't survive.
They needed a spokesman. They needed a leader to step to the front. And that brings us to the most complex, fascinating character study in the canonical texts.
We have to examine Peter.
This is where the texts completely subvert our expectations of how religious propaganda is supposed to work.
Oh, absolutely.
If you are inventing a religion from scratch and you're writing the foundational documents, the standard playbook is to make your founding leader look like an absolute untouchable demigod. You make him flawless, brilliant, and unfailingly brave.
Like a Roman hero.
Exactly. But the canonical texts refuse to idealize their heroes. Peter is undeniably the chief spokesman. He is the central figure in the first dozen chapters of Acts, but the texts portray him as deeply, painfully, almost embarrassingly flawed.
The portrayal of Peter is a testament to the raw authenticity of the source material. His birth name was Simon, but Jesus gives him the Aramaic surname Kophas, which translates to Petros in Greek, meaning rock.
A very strong title.
It's a profound title that signals his foundational role in the community. And Peter certainly has moments where he lives up to the name. In Matthew 16, he is the one who steps forward and truly confesses Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God.
But the whiplash is immediate. Almost the very next breath after this profound, universe-altering confession, Jesus explains that his messiahship involves suffering and death. And Peter essentially takes Jesus aside and rebukes him, completely misunderstanding the mission.
He gets the title right, but he gets the definition of the title entirely wrong. He expects a conquering king, not a suffering servant.
And that fundamental misunderstanding sets the stage for the defining crisis of Peter's life, the denial.
We need to analyze the denial, not just as a sad story, but through the lens of the honor and shame culture we discussed earlier.
That context changes everything, because we often read this as a private moment of moral failure. Peter got scared, he lied, and he felt bad about it later. But in the first century context, the stakes are so much higher than hurt feelings.
The stakes are total social annihilation. In the chaotic hours following the arrest of Jesus, Peter, the man who boldly swore just hours earlier that he would die before abandoning his rabbi, is lingering in the courtyard of the high priest.
He's trying to blend in.
Right. And he is recognized not by Roman soldiers with swords, but by a servant girl. And under the pressure of a low-status servant's questioning, he caves. He adamantly denies even knowing Jesus 3 separate times, invoking curses upon himself.
Why does the text specifically highlight that it was a servant girl who prompted the denial? Is that significant?
It is massively significant because it maximizes the social shame. In a patriarchal, honor-driven society, for the appointed leader of a movement to cower and lie out of fear of a female servant is the ultimate public humiliation.
It's the lowest possible status defeating the highest.
Exactly. He didn't just fail a moral test in private. He publicly repudiated his patron, his master, in the most cowardly way possible. By every sociological rule of the ancient Mediterranean, Peter's leadership should have permanently ended in that courtyard. He was categorically disqualified. The shame was absolute.
So how does a man whose reputation is reduced to ash become the fiery, unshakable preacher we see just weeks later in the book of Acts, standing up to the very same high priests who executed his rabbi?
The psychological and vocational restoration of Peter hinges on a deeply poignant scene recorded in the 21st chapter of the Gospel of John. It's a post-resurrection account where Jesus appears to the disciples by the Sea of Galilee.
They're having breakfast, right?
Yes, they have a meal around a charcoal fire, which is a deliberate, haunting, literary callback to the charcoal fire in the courtyard where Peter denied him.
Oh, wow. So the setting forces Peter to confront the memory of his failure.
Exactly. Jesus does not gloss over the betrayal. He doesn't tell Peter to just forget about it and move on. Instead, he asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" The 3 questions painfully mirror the 3 denials.
Reversing the damage.
Yes. But with each agonizing affirmation from Peter, Jesus issues a commission. Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep.
He is reinstalling him into office.
He is publicly restoring Peter's honor. But the crucial theological shift is that Peter's honor is no longer based on his own bravado, his strength, or his perfection. It is based entirely on grace. Jesus restores him not because Peter is unbreakable, but because Peter has been broken and forgiven.
What does that restoration mean for the broader movement? It seems like it establishes an entirely new paradigm for how power and leadership operate.
It creates a complete inversion of Roman leadership values. In Rome, you lead by projecting absolute invulnerability. You hide your weaknesses, you crush your rivals, and you demand honor.
Never let them see you sweat.
Exactly. But in the apostolic community, the paradigm is inverted. You lead precisely because you know your own capacity for failure, and you have been sustained by grace. The takeaway the early church drew from Peter's life is that a strong theological confession doesn't magically eliminate human weakness, but catastrophic failure isn't final. Grace creates durable, humble usefulness.
The leader isn't the strongest man in the room, he is the most forgiven man in the room.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it.
And Peter takes that restored, grace-based authority and uses it to initiate the expansion of the movement. In the opening chapters of Acts, Peter's the one who preaches at Pentecost, bringing thousands of Jews into the fold. He's then instrumental in bridging the gap to the Samaritans. And finally, in Acts chapter 10, he crosses a seemingly insurmountable ethnic and ritual boundary by entering the home of Cornelius, a Roman centurion, a Gentile, and baptizing him.
Peter officially unlocks the door to the Gentile world. He establishes the crucial theological precedent that non-Jews, those outside the Mosaic covenant, can be grafted into this new community.
But while Peter courageously opened the door, another figure was being prepared in the background who was about to burst onto the scene and blow the doors completely off their hinges, taking the message to the furthest reaches of the empire.
We are talking about Paul.
We are moving from the fisherman to the scholar, from the man called the Rock to a man whose entire life story is defined by absolute violent whiplash. We have to dive into the life and mind of the Apostle Paul, the chief architect of the Gentile mission.
Paul is arguably one of the most fascinating intellectual figures in ancient history. His biographical profile is incredibly complex, combining intersecting cultural identities that made him uniquely suited for the global task he eventually undertakes.
Let's break down his background.
So as presented in the book of Acts and his own letters, he was originally known as Saul, a Jew born in the city of Tarsus.
Now, when we say Tarsus, we aren't talking about a dusty backwater village. We need to locate this in the Roman world.
Not at all. Tarsus was a major, wealthy, cosmopolitan metropolis in the Roman province of Cilicia, in modern-day Turkey. It was a renowned intellectual hub, famous for its universities and Stoic philosophers. It rivaled Athens and Alexandria as a center of learning.
So he's an urbanite.
Exactly. So right from birth, Paul is deeply immersed in an urban Hellenistic environment. He grows up with a high level of Greek literacy. He understands Greek rhetoric, poetry, and civic life.
And he also inherits a massive legal trump card, Roman citizenship.
Yes, which was a rare and highly coveted status in the provinces. It afforded him legal protections, the right to due process, exemption from certain degrading punishments, and a mobility throughout the empire that most people could only dream of.
Wait, if he's immersed in Greek philosophy and holds Roman citizenship, how does he maintain his Jewish identity? Aren't those worlds colliding?
They are constantly in tension, which is exactly what makes his mind so sharp. Internally, his identity was fiercely, uncompromisingly Jewish. He was sent to Jerusalem to be educated under Gamaliel, one of the most celebrated rabbis of the era.
The best of the best.
The absolute elite. Paul was trained strictly as a Pharisee, meaning he was obsessed with the rigorous, exact application of the Torah to everyday life, aiming to maintain the ritual purity of Israel.
So you have a man who possesses the intellectual rigor of a Greek rhetorician, the legal invulnerability of a Roman citizen, and the burning theological zeal of a Pharisee. And what does he do with all that immense potential? In his early years, he turns it into a weapon. He becomes a systematic, violent persecutor of the early church.
By his own admission in his letter to the Galatians, he states that he was advancing in Judaism beyond many of his peers, and he was violently trying to destroy the church.
Why was he so angry? What was it about this movement that triggered a highly educated Pharisee to resort to violence?
To a Pharisee like Paul, the Jesus movement wasn't just a minor disagreement over theology. It was a dangerous, blasphemous heresy that threatened the very survival of Israel.
How so?
Well, the followers of Jesus were claiming that the crucified criminal was the Messiah. To Paul, Deuteronomy clearly stated that anyone hung on a tree was cursed by God. You can't have a cursed Messiah. Furthermore, this movement was beginning to blur the lines of ritual purity and Torah observance. In Paul's mind, God was going to judge Israel if they didn't stamp out this corruption. He believed his violence was an act of holy zeal.
I really want you listening to grasp the psychological magnitude of the pivot that happens next. The man leading the Inquisition, the man holding the coats while Stephen, the first Christian martyr, is stoned to death, becomes the movement's most famous, most prolific advocate.
It is a stunning reversal.
He goes from being the chief executioner to the chief missionary theologian. How did the sources account for this complete reversal? Does he just gradually change his mind after reading a convincing scroll?
Not at all. The text described the pivot as a sudden, violent interruption. It occurs on the road to Damascus, detailed in Acts 9 and referenced heavily in Paul's own writings. It is described as a blinding, apocalyptic encounter with the resurrected Christ.
A literal flash of light.
Yes. And this specific nature of his conversion dictates his entire theology moving forward. In Galatians, Paul fiercely defends his authority by insisting on the concept of revelation over derivation.
Let's define those terms. What does he mean by derivation?
Derivation would mean he derived his message from a human source. He didn't travel to Jerusalem, sit down with Peter and James, and take a 6-week training course on Christian theology. He didn't read a manual.
He didn't get his degree from the original apostles.
Exactly. He insists that his gospel was given to him directly by divine revelation of Jesus Christ. The Damascus Road experience completely short-circuited his Pharisaic worldview. He realized in an instant that the man he thought was a cursed criminal was actually the exalted Lord of the universe.
And out of the ashes of that shattered worldview flows some of the most dense, complex, and world-changing theology ever written. We have to do a deep dive into his theological architecture here.
We definitely should.
Paul doesn't just travel and plant churches. He writes letters that provide the doctrinal scaffolding for the entire movement. Let's impartially break down his core message, starting with the engine that drives all of his thought. Soteriology, or the doctrine of salvation. Specifically, we need to unpack his concept of justification by faith.
If you want to understand Paul, especially his magnum opus, the letter to the Romans, specifically chapters 3 through 5, and his fiery letter to the Galatians, you must understand justification. To grasp its revolutionary nature, we must look at the first-century Jewish context.
Set the baseline for us.
In the Second Temple period, righteousness, or being in right standing with the covenant God, was generally understood to be maintained by adherence to the Torah, the law of Moses.
Right. It was a covenant of action. If you want to be identified as part of the covenant people of God, you adopt the covenant lifestyle. You undergo circumcision, you keep the Sabbath strictly, and you observe kosher dietary laws.
Exactly.
These were the cultural boundary markers that separated the holy people from the pagan world.
Yes. But Paul looks at the cross and the resurrection, and he looks at his own failure as a flawless Pharisee who ended up murdering people, and he realizes that human effort is fundamentally flawed. This is his anthropology, his view of humanity.
That's a pretty bleak view, initially.
It is. He argues that all humans, both Jews with the law and Gentiles without it, are enslaved to sin and morally incapable of perfect obedience. Therefore, if salvation depends on perfectly keeping the law, everyone is doomed. Salvation cannot be a wage earned by works. It must be an external gift.
And this is where the Greek vocabulary becomes essential. Walk us through the specific words Paul uses to build this argument.
The foundational word is charis, which we translate as grace. But in the ancient world, a gift often came with strings attached at the patron-client relationship we discussed earlier.
Right. I give you a gift, you owe me your loyalty forever.
Exactly. Paul radically redefines charis as an entirely unmerited, freely given, unconditional gift from God, achieved through the sacrificial death of Christ. The required human response to that grace is not a list of works, but pistis.
Pistis usually gets translated simply as faith. But does it just mean intellectually agreeing that something is true?
No, pistis is much richer than mere intellectual assent. It means trust, allegiance, and fidelity. It is throwing your entire weight upon the promises of God. Paul argues that when a person responds with pistis, they are justified.
Justified. Another big word.
The Greek term is dikaiosine, which is a legal term meaning to be declared righteous or acquitted in a court of law. Paul's explosive claim is that human beings are declared righteous not by what they achieve through the law, but by their faith in what Christ achieved on the cross.
Let's pause and make sure the sheer sociological gravity of this is clear to you listening. Paul is claiming that the creator of the universe accepts people based on their faith in Christ. Full stop. Not based on their ethnic pedigree. Not based on their strict adherence to the ritual laws of Moses.
This specific theological doctrine is the vital mechanism that allowed a Jewish sect to become a global religion. Think about the sociological application. If justification is by faith alone, then a Greek pagan living in the city of Ephesus does not need to undergo the painful process of adult circumcision, abandon his culture, adopt kosher dietary laws, and essentially convert to Judaism in order to be accepted into the community of God.
They don't have to become culturally Jewish first.
Right. Paul's theology of justification levels the ethnic and religious playing field entirely. Jews and Gentiles stand on the exact same footing as desperate sinners in need of grace.
It's brilliant. It constructs an entirely new category of humanity. The world is no longer divided into us versus them based on thousands of years of cultural tradition and boundary markers. It is just us, united by faith.
It's a radical unifying concept.
But let's be realistic here. You are telling a first-century Jewish audience, people who have suffered and bled for centuries to maintain their unique covenant identity, that the pagan Gentiles are suddenly equal partners without having to follow the law of Moses. That is going to cause massive friction.
It caused an absolute existential crisis in the early church. We see this friction erupt in the city of Antioch, where Jewish and Gentile believers were eating together until some strict members from Jerusalem arrived, and suddenly the Jewish believers withdrew from the Gentiles to maintain kosher purity.
And Peter got caught up in that, didn't he?
He did. Paul famously confronts Peter publicly over this, arguing that separating from the Gentiles is a betrayal of the gospel of grace.
The tension is palpable. I want to push back on Paul's logic here on behalf of those early Jewish Christians, because from their perspective, it looks like Paul is just inventing a new religion. What does his theology mean for the history of Israel? Did Paul believe that God just changed his mind? Did he view his Gentile mission as a total contradiction of the promises God made in the Hebrew Scriptures?
That is the exact accusation his opponents leveled against him. But Paul's answer, laid out meticulously in Romans chapters 9 through 11, is an emphatic, resounding no. Paul did not view himself as the founder of a new religion that replaced the old one. He understood his mission to the Gentiles as the ultimate maturation and fulfillment of the Old Testament promises, not an abandonment of them.
How does he prove that? The source material provides a covenant progression diagram to help visualize this redemptive historical analysis. Walk us through this grand tapestry to show how Paul connects the cross to the ancient promises.
Paul bypasses Moses and goes all the way back to the very beginning, to the book of Genesis. He focuses on the original covenant made with Abraham. God promises Abraham that through his offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That is the foundational, overarching promise, a global blessing.
Okay, so the end goal was always global, but then the story narrows significantly.
Yes. The narrative moves to the Exodus and Mount Sinai. Here, the descendants of Abraham are formed into a specific nation, Israel, governed by the law of Moses. They are intended to be a priestly kingdom, a light to the surrounding nations. The progression continues into the kingdom era, particularly under King David, where the promise is narrowed further to a specific royal lineage and eternal throne.
But then the narrative collapses into tragedy. The kings are corrupt, the nation fails to keep the covenant, the temple is burned to the ground by Babylon, and the people are sent into exile. And even when they are allowed to return to Jerusalem, the glory days are gone. They are subjugated by the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. They are living in their own land, but they are not free. They are waiting for the definitive intervention of God, the arrival of the Messiah, to fix the broken world.
Precisely. And the canonical texts assert that Jesus is that long-awaited Messiah. However, his method of victory, crucifixion, and resurrection, rather than military conquest, completely upends their expectations. But the resurrection proves that the climax of Israel's story has arrived. And following the resurrection comes Pentecost, the outpouring of the Spirit, which leads us to the era Paul is operating in, the mission to the nations.
And this is where Paul's theology clicks the entire ancient timeline into place.
Yes, Paul argues that by bringing the pagan Gentiles into the covenant community through faith in Christ, without requiring them to become culturally Jewish, he is not destroying the old promise, he is finally activating it. The inclusion of the Gentiles is the definitive, visible proof that the ancient promise made to Abraham that all nations would be blessed has actually come true. The church, comprising both Jew and Gentile worshiping together, becomes the eschatological people of God.
Eschatological. That is a massive theological term that gets thrown around a lot in academic circles. Essentially, it means dealing with the end times, the ultimate destiny of humanity, and the cosmos. And our sources point out a very specific psychological tension regarding how the apostles viewed time and history in this eschatological framework. It's called the already not yet horizon. Explain how they lived in that tension.
The already not yet tension is the defining characteristic of the apostolic worldview. Because of the resurrection, the apostles firmly believed that the kingdom of God had already been inaugurated. The decisive battle against sin and death had been won. The new creation had begun in the person of Jesus.
But they only had to look out the window to see that the world was still broken.
Exactly. They saw Roman oppression, they experienced disease, they suffered intense persecution, and they buried their friends. They recognized that while the victory was secure, the kingdom had not yet been fully consummated. The old world was still dying, and the new world was still being born.
They are living in the middle space. It's like D-Day has happened, the fatal blow to the enemy has been struck, but the war isn't officially over yet. There is still fighting to be done.
That is an excellent analogy. They were living their daily lives in eager anticipation of the Parousia, a Greek word meaning the coming or the presence, referring to the ultimate return of Christ to finalize the new creation and wipe away every tear. And living in that tense middle space, knowing the absolute truth but waiting for its final, visible realization, requires a very specific, often dangerous posture in the world. It requires the community to act as a witness.
Which brings us to perhaps the most haunting and beautiful linguistic evolution we see in the sources. Let's look at the Greek word martes. If you were walking through a forum in Athens or Corinth in the first century in a purely secular context, what did martes mean?
In classical Greek and secular first-century usage, a martis was simply a legal or observational term. It meant a witness, someone who testifies in a court of law to what they have seen or heard, establishing the facts of a case. The apostles viewed their primary vocation as being a martyrs to the resurrection of Jesus. They were testifying to a historical event.
But as the timeline moves forward, as the 40s turn into the 50s and the 50s turn into the 60s CE, the cultural temperature changes. The pushback from local synagogues and, more significantly, the violent crackdowns from the Roman Empire grow intense. And as that violence escalates, that simple legal word undergoes a dark, profound transformation.
It is forced to evolve because the nature of the testimony is inherently dangerous. To publicly bear witness that a man crucified by the Roman Empire as a state criminal is actually the resurrected Lord of the universe is an act of political subversion. It is claiming that there is a king above Caesar. The historical tradition, reflecting the trajectory of the canonical text, reveals that the act of witnessing became inextricably, fatally linked with suffering.
The cost of being a witness became your life. So the Greek word for witness literally becomes our modern word for martyr.
Exactly. A martyr is simply a witness whose testimony is sealed with their blood. And the historical record, though scholars debate the exact dates and details, broadly maintains that the foundational leaders of this movement met violent ends. The ancient tradition holds that the Apostle Paul was executed in Rome, likely beheaded a privilege of his Roman citizenship under the deranged reign of Emperor Nero, likely around 62 to 64 CE, possibly in connection with the persecution following the Great Fire of Rome.
And Peter.
Peter is also traditionally remembered as being martyred in Rome during that same Neronian persecution. The ancient historian Eusebius, quoting earlier traditions, states that Peter was crucified and requested to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in the exact same manner as his Lord.
Whether every detail of those traditions is perfectly accurate or not, the overarching reality is undeniable. The apostolic pattern is fundamentally not about self-exalting leadership. It is what the source material describes as a cruciform witness. Their leadership, their ministry, and ultimately their deaths took the shape of the cross. They didn't leverage their massive global movement to acquire political power, build palaces, or accumulate personal wealth. They bled for it.
And that stark historical reality, the cruciform nature of their mission and their willingness to die for their testimony, forces us to shift our gaze from the ancient ruins and ask the most important question of any historical study. What does this mean for us today?
Absolutely. The source material explicitly outlines the contemporary relevance of the apostolic story, and I think its application is incredibly potent, maybe more now than ever. When I observe our modern cultural landscape, the defining characteristic is overwhelming fragmentation. We are endlessly, exhaustingly divided. We are fractured along political lines, socioeconomic class lines, racial lines, and ideological boundaries. We curate our digital lives so that every algorithm we interact with pushes us further into isolated silos, training us to view anyone on the other side not just as mistaken, but as evil.
We live in a highly polarized, hyper-individualized environment that thrives on outrage and division. And yet, look at the sociological model we just spent an hour unpacking. The early church was a community that actively, intentionally, and successfully united politically and socially divergent individuals in a way that defied the logic of their era.
You had a Jewish nationalistic zealot, a Roman collaborating tax collector, Greek intellectuals, Roman citizens, wealthy patrons, and enslaved people, all gathering in the exact same household churches, sharing the same meal, and calling each other brother and sister.
They overcame those massive, deeply ingrained ethnic and social divisions. But, and this is the crucial nuance that modern society often misses, they achieved this unity without erasing their real differences.
Right. Paul didn't demand that the Jewish believers stop being culturally Jewish, and he didn't demand that the Greeks abandon their Hellenistic heritage to become Jewish clones. Their unity wasn't based on superficial uniformity. It was based on a shared, transformative participation in Christ that superseded their secondary identities. That speaks so directly, so piercingly to our modern fragmentation. It proves that true unity does not require the erasure of truth, identity, or conviction. It requires elevating a shared, higher allegiance above our tribal instincts.
Furthermore, the apostolic era provides a masterclass in how to navigate what we might call empire. We live in our own modern version of a dense, complex, often overwhelming religious and cultural marketplace, full of competing ideologies and political pressures. The early Christians lived in the shadow of the literal Roman Empire. They were surrounded by extreme pluralism, mandatory civic cults, and immense pressure to conform to the imperial worldview.
And how did they respond? Because today you typically see two extreme, flawed reactions when people feel their values are threatened by the broader culture. The first is political triumphalism. People try to aggressively grab the levers of power, legislate their morality, and force everyone else to comply. The second is sectarian withdrawal. They build a cultural bunker, lock the doors, and completely disengage from society out of fear.
The brilliance of the apostolic model is that they categorically rejected both of those extremes. They rejected the sword of political triumphalism. They understood that the kingdom of God could not be advanced through coercion or imperial politics. But they equally rejected the cowardice of sectarian withdrawal. They didn't retreat to the desert. They engaged the culture deeply. They stood in the centers of commerce and power in the crowded forums of Corinth, the massive theaters of Ephesus, the philosophical courts of Athens, and the imperial heart of Rome. And they practiced faithful, unyielding public truth-telling.
They maintained a profound moral seriousness, refusing to compromise their core convictions, while simultaneously displaying a confident, joyful hope that allowed them to love their enemies. They were in the world, deeply engaged with the people around them, but they refused to be compromised by its systems of power. So, if we had to distill the practical takeaways from this massive synthesis of history, theology, and sociology, what are the major lessons we can extract?
I would distill it into three core principles. First, leadership is inherently vocational before it is institutional. It isn't about climbing a corporate ladder, asserting dominance, or projecting perfection. True leadership is a calling to serve, characterized by a willingness to be broken, corrected, and restored by grace, much like Peter. Second, authentic unity does not require erasing truth or pretending differences don't exist. It requires the radical application of grace. And third, discipleship is not merely a passive program of intellectual self-improvement or moral management. It is active, risky participation in the life, the mission, and often the suffering of the crucified and risen Christ.
That is an incredibly challenging but undeniably beautiful vision for human flourishing. Let's summarize the grand, sweeping narrative we've covered today in this deep dive. We started at the very foundation, examining how Jesus intentionally formed a renewed covenant people, choosing 12 authorized envoys to mathematically and symbolically represent a restored Israel. We watched that small, volatile movement, empowered by their conviction of the resurrection, expand rapidly through the complex, highly stratified Roman Mediterranean world. We firmly anchored that expansion in the hard dirt of archaeology, validating the historical timeline with unshakable evidence like the Pilate and Gallio inscriptions.
And we trace the profound theological architecture built by Paul, analyzing how his doctrine of justification by faith alone shattered ethnic barriers. He provided the theological mechanism that allowed Jews and Gentiles to unite into one multi-ethnic new covenant community, proving that the ancient promises made to Abraham were always intended to bless the entire world.
From the dusty, agrarian roads of Galilee to the marble heart of the Roman Empire, it is the definitive story of grace transforming violent persecutors into brilliant theologians and blue-collar fishermen into the foundational pillars of a community that outlasted the empire that tried to destroy it. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own.
It's the important point to reflect on.
Early on in our discussion, we touched upon Judas Iscariot. He was part of the original 12. He had a front row seat to the greatest events in history. He saw the miracles with his own eyes. He heard the teaching directly from the source. He was physically and intellectually closer to the absolute epicenter of this movement than almost any other human being, and yet his proximity did not equal saving faith. He remained internally untransformed by the truth he was standing next to, and he became a tragic, permanent warning figure.
Proximity is not the same as transformation.
Exactly. It forces you to pause and wonder. In our modern era, an era defined by infinite podcasts, endless articles, 247 news cycles, and absolute information overload, how often do we mistake simply being close to information with actually being transformed by it?
That is a piercing and profound question to end on. Gathering historical data and theological knowledge is vital, but as the lives of the apostles powerfully demonstrate, knowledge only achieves its true purpose when it is internalized, lived out, and allowed to fundamentally transform who we are.
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this massive deep dive. Remember, true learning is not a destination. It is an ongoing, lifelong journey. Keep questioning the consensus, keep exploring the sources, and keep diving deep. Because whether you are a blue-collar worker or a highly trained scholar, there is always more depth to the story. We'll catch you next time.